Okay, good morning. So we'll call this Tzimtzum Kipshutei, not Kipshutei, part 2. So last week I reviewed, based primarily on the Rebbe's letter, Tzadik Tes, the dated Yud Teshvat, Tofres Tzadik Tes, Rabbi Jacobson, printed in Igris Kedish, Chelik Aleph, page Yud Tes, that the Rebbe breaks down that there's Dalet Shittas, he says. The Efshib is a Dalet Shittas. So, and how does that work? Basically like Shtayim Shein Arba, that one issue is the issue whether the Tzimtzum was literal, Kipshutei, or not. And the second, where did it impact? In Moir or also in Moir? So in the first part, I spoke at length about the general, what does Kipshutei and not Kipshutei mean? We didn't talk about the Oyer and Moyer so much, which is what I want to address today. And I'll just sum up, because it's all obviously Negeya. Everything flows into the next point. And the Kudus Advarim is this. And on Marmakemis I had written down, it's already on the group. I also mentioned them last week, if you want to look it up in detail. Starting from the Yeshel Levov, Mishas Chassidim, Bal Mishas Chassidim, all the way through the Gra and Alter Rebbe, and the different places, mostly, as I said, the Rebbe really talked about it more in detail. Also a letter in Beis Rebbe, which I'll refer to shortly. So, the Kudah is, first of all, we need to know what the Chiddush of the Tzimtzum is, Bechlal of the Arizah. As I said, you can't just say just that the Eibishter conceals himself. You don't need the Arizal for it. It's a Beferish, a Pasuk, Haster, Aster, Ponai, and it's simple logic. If you don't see a Lakus, it means that it's concealed. So you don't need the Arizal to tell us the Eibishter is concealed. But then, the exact opposite actually, that Tzimtzum, paradoxically, actually creates a relationship with levels of Elikus that on our own would never be able to have a connection. If, for example, Iliyat Tzur, the Eibishter did not make a Tzimtzum, so then the only way you could speak about and say is that the Elikus that we have a relationship with is Lefi Erechas. Why would the Eibishter need a Tzimtzum? He doesn't need a Tzimtzum. It's only for us. So if a Rav, let's say, whose mind is Bli Gvul, and he doesn't want you to know about his Bli Gvul, he doesn't have to make a Tzimtzum. He just reveals what he wants to reveal to you, and that's it. The fact that he creates a Tzimtzum, and the fact that he tells us about it, is telling you, I want you to know that I have something that I need to be mitzamtzum. And what am I being mitzamtzum? The Erein Sof HaBli Gvul Lifnei HaTzimtzum. So that alone tells us something about the Eibishter as he is beyond us, the Shalei Be'erech. That was the Nekuda. I'm not going to go over Berichas over that because I spoke about it pretty much at length. But then, once you know that, then comes the bigger question is, how can you have a relationship? The question is the Fakert. Okay. How could you have a relationship to something that's Shalei Be'erech to you? If in the Moshel, or in the words of that Arizal, if Erein Sof would not have a Tzimtzum, Lo Yehoyer Nesinas Mokum Le'elam is Klal. So once there is a Tzimtzum, fine. We know that there's a reality that's beyond the Tzimtzum and is greater than us. But Haguf is the purpose of the Tzimtzum is that Take, we can't exist in the light of Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. So it's true, a Kav was Nimshach, but it's only a Kav Kotzer V'dak, which means in the Moshel of the Rav and the Talmud, the Rav concealed his so-called brilliance, his Bli Gvul Seichel, and we have as a stream, a narrow stream. But that's what we have. So here comes the question, what kind of Tzimtzum is this exactly? So those that hold Kipshutei, really, as the Rebbe said, is more logical unless we hear otherwise, because it makes more sense that the Eibishter is off limits than that we have a connection. It's easier to reconcile Gvul and Bli Gvul if the Bli Gvul is completely beyond us. So we know. So that's what that is, Oz Machadish, we know. And but our relationship is with the Kav, basically. In other words, in a Chiv Dika way, our only way to have a relationship is to a Lekuz that bends down, so to speak, to our Madrege, which is after the Tzimtzum. And with that, we can grow plenty. Remember, Lekuz, the Kav, and Malakalam, and even Sevu Kalam after the Tzimtzum is pretty high Madreges. The Alter Rebbe would tremble when he even said the word Atzilus. By us, we don't even tremble when we say it in Self Lifnei Tzimtzum. but these are high madregas. It's not like push it to levels. So the Tzimtzum Kipshute, the shit of Tzimtzum Kipshute would be the Eibestaka Shalei Be'erech. That part will always remain to us, b'yediyas hashlila, so to speak. You can access it not in a direct way. Like I spoke the last week, al derech. It's only al derech, like how we find that Lakus in things like Shalosh Klipos Atmeis. There's also a nitzutz kedusha there, but it's through tchiyah, not through chiyuv. You can't access it because it's also b'dei chitzenim, also b'kosher, as Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, and the only way is through tchiyah. So al derech ze elam hazeh, which is a mokim moli klippos v'sitra achre v'shoyim gevrim bei. These are all the shenis from Eitz Chaim that Alter Rebbe quotes. So it's like a mokim ha'ashba, in the words of the Yeshua Levov, who's the first shita from the Talmidei Arizal that advocates Tzimtzum Kipshute, the interpretation, the first shita, that it's Kipshute. And the only relationship we have is the words he uses is with Hashgachase, not with the Eibishter himself. So of course, those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute, we're talking mitzad gadlus habeida. Of course, they don't deny psukim chad v'shalom like Eined Movade or the Zohar les asar ponim minei. How do they then teach les asar ponim minei? They teach les asar ponim minei mehashgachase, like the melech that looks into the window in the mashal of a beis akise. So he's not in there, b'pnimius b'slapshus. It's more b'efem makif. The Rebbe used the expression in one of the letters or one of the places, like tzhu tziva v'nivro, like mamaylo lamata, not b'slapshus pnimius. So that's what Tzimtzum Kipshute would mean, according to the Shita, and it also explains that these are Gdei Yisrael, and they didn't come to Chaz v'Sholom remove the Eibishter from existence, like Ozav Hashem, that in Perek Beis in Tanya, which is Mamish Kfira. And that's why the Lashenis are very different. The Rebbe explains in Perek Beis, the Alter Rebbe Shelet B'Tachlis, Mamish Avei Zara, or Shittuf, whatever. But in Perek Zayin, he says, Shkogo in their way of understanding, he doesn't use Lashenis that are that they're Hepech HaTeirah. Just then they're mistaken. And why did the Alter Rebbe say it? According to the Rebbe, is because the Alter Rebbe was Mekabel from his Rabbeim. The Pasha is the Magid, and I guess from the Baal Shem Tov that the Magid was Mekabel. That the shit is Shalei Kipshute, which would mean that we could have a chiyuv dika relationship even with Eidei and Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. So how does the Eitz Chaim say, but loya in the sinis mokum the elam is klal? That's b'tchila, that's that way. The teacher conceals the seichel because the student is a child, is a beginner. So you have to conceal. But then, as the student grows and the kelim expand, and there's the zichuch and bitter of Metzias Elam, we become kelim through the kav. It expands to the point you could even access the teacher's mind. For example, the teacher's mind, and even greater than that, Er Chodesh that wasn't even there before the Tzimtzum Begole, as the Rebbe Rashab says right in the beginning of Samach Vov. So that's a summation a bit of the Kipshute, Lach Kipshute difference in Hashkafa, and also Nafkamina we spoke about at length. It's a Nafkamina, how we look at this world. Do we look in the even of Tchiyas Elam? We engage in this world, everybody has to do. No one argues that Tzimtzum Kipshute don't hold, God forbid, that we have to try to leave this world. They also hold you have to engage and do Torah mitzvahs as the Eibishter sent us here. But it's like a little like the Meraglim. Elam Hazeh is almost a stira telekus because Eretz Echel is Shishver. So as much as we can, as much as possible, we avoid the world. You know, in more in a broader way, it would be like a shita of Prishus, of Prushim. Again, it's not exactly that I'm not suggesting everyone that held Tzimtzum Kipshute was a Porush, but in Hashkafa it's similar. Or I explained the difference between the Rambam and the Ramban. Is the Tachlis Ascha Neshamis alone or Neshamis Begufim? That too would have a similar implication. I mean, there are many other such implications. And the interesting thing is, like I said, it's that once you understand it this way, that's why we have no problem talking about the shit of Tzimtzum Kipshute. Because even after the psak of the Alter Rebbe that it's not that way, it still reveals for us certain aspects of Elokus. The idea of Shalei Be'erech. So even that Havamina, and those that hold it, it's not the Yeshua Levov is the Baal Mishnah's Chassidim. Chassidus cites him. They don't dismiss him and say, "Oh, you had the wrong shita, so that's we don't follow." Mishnah's Chassidim is cited all the time in Chassidus. So that is somewhat of a summation of those two shitas. So basically, Tzimtzum Kipshute, not Kipshute, And of course, Chassidus Chabad goes, Tzimtzum not Kipshute. And now we're going to talk about the Moir and Oir. So the Rebbe says the following. In the both shittas itself, there's two shittas. So in those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute, use the Rebbe's Lashon exactly. The shitta, Hatzimtzum Aleph, Hatzimtzum Kipshute v'gam ba'atzmusei, v'rayis ha'sevrim came. And the proof that those that hold like this is actually the words from the Yeshua Levov. The Eich Efshali Lemer, or Efshali is the Hamelech Nimtze b'mkema Ashbachaz b'shar. So that applies not just to Oir, but also to the Moir. So that's shitta number one. Interesting, the Rebbe uses Batzmusei. In the others, he's going to use the word Moir. Then shitta beis have Tzimtzum Kipshute al Rag ba'Oir. So in the Kipshute element, it's similar to shitta one, but it doesn't affect the Moir. It's only in Oir. Shitta Gimel, Hatzimtzum the Glei Kipshute of Gam b'Moir. So now it's the other way. It's not Kipshute, but also affects the Moir. Doesn't say Hatzmusei. Just interesting point. And finally, Dalet is Hatzimtzum Glei Kipshute v'Rag ba'Oir. And later he'll say that's Shittas Chabad, the fourth. Just to give a little information, as I mentioned, this letter, the Rebbe added some additions to this letter when he was writing the Hagos on Tanya. You know, the Rebbe also prepared. He never published it. Lately, it's been published, parts of it or most of it. The Rebbe wrote Hagos. He wanted to give out a Tanya HaShalom with a bunch of, with Maramikemis and sources and things from the Rabbi on Tanya. And the Rebbe himself wrote Hagos on Tanya. So in this piece in Tanya, Perek Zayin, the Rebbe has Hagos, which are from this letter. He refers to this letter, but he actually adds who holds which shitta here. He says the shitta Aleph is the Yeshua Levov. Regarding the Gra, the Rebbe debates himself whether the Gra held like shitta Aleph or shitta Beis. Definitely Kipshute. The question is, it's not clear from the Gra's Lashon in Sifrei Ditzniusa at the end, in his Pirush on Sifrei Ditzniusa, whether he holds like Aleph or Beis. Kipshute, but the question is Moir in there. The Rebbe has a Shakavitaria there in these Hagos on Tanya. Shitta Gimel, interestingly, the Rebbe says the Shemer Amunim holds that, because the Shemer Amunim comes out very strong against the Yeshua Levov in saying that it's Befedish, not Kipshute. But in the Tzemach Tzedek and Derech Mitzecha, it's mashma that the Shemer Amunim also is not like the Shitta of Chabad. So the Rebbe says that the Shitta 3, which means not Kipshute, yeah, and that he's similar to Shittas Chabad, but also Moir. And the Rebbe also adds in the letter here, he says clearly, he says like this, Shittas Pala Mechaber Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, I'm reading from the letter, which is of course the Talmud of the Gra, Shemaskir, the Kvei Terasa B'Mechtave, Rabbi Jacobson mentioned his Shitta, Hu Keshita Gimel Hanal. So basically the Rebbe is saying the Nefesh HaChaim is like the Shemer Amunim, V'cholok b'zeh al Rabbi HaGra. So the Nefesh HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, disagrees about this with the Gra. Well, B'chlal, I'll just add this line, the Rebbe adds, B'chlal nira shero Rabbi Chaim Volozhin Sifrei Chabad, B'frat Sefer HaTanya, V'nishpa mehem, af she'eni yudei zeh b'yichoches gemuris. That's what the Rebbe writes. So in other words, that he was influenced by the Tanya, even though the Rebbe doesn't have b'yichoches gemuris. I will just add that there's a recording of a Rav Soloveitchik, the Rav of Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who comes, of course, from the Gezha of Brisk and Volozhin. And he says clearly that the whole Nefesh HaChaim, this is not my Lashon, it's his Lashon, it's quite amazing. He says Nefesh HaChaim is basically Tanya, just in different language. And that the only differences in nuances and language and sprach and style. That's what he says. He says the Nefesh HaChaim is basically the Shitta of Tanya. Now, if it's coming from him, it's a pretty credible, because he would have many reasons to say that it's different. But he doesn't. He says this in the Fabringen, the Yutes Kislev Fabringen he led in Boston many years ago. There's a recording of it, very interesting recording, B'chlal, about the whole Parsha when the Alter Rebbe came to see the Gra and how the Gra avoided. It's very interesting. But that's a Derech Hag. If any of you want the recording, I'll be happy to post it. Why not? He speaks in Yiddish, very reich Yiddish. Of course, he talks about his whole upbringing. He lived in a Chassidus shtetl with a Chassidus teacher and so on and so forth. Okay, it's very entertaining too, just for the record. So getting back now, so what does exactly this mean? What is this moyer and oyer thing? And what's the same question I was asking? What's the difference in hashkafa if it's a moyer and oyer? And my mind of kamina la v'dasenu in our life. So we have to go a little deeper into the whole concept. What is moyer and oyer first before we talk about what means tzimtzum b'moyer and tzimtzum b'oyer. So it's mentioned last week, a different way of calling moyer and oyer, you can call etzem and ispashtus. The moshel Chassidus gives is moyer and oyer because it's an easy moshel to relate to. So the classic moshel, we all know moyer hashemesh, the sun, and oyer hashemesh, and the light of the sun. So moshel brought to many places, Shaykh Gamun and other places. So the moyer is the mokera oyer, and the oyer is that which extends from it. So in Gashmi Se'elam, they're not in the same mokim. Sunlight, the sun doesn't exist on earth, but the sunlight absolutely does. But the sunlight doesn't have anything of its own, only that which the sun transmits through it. Take away the sun, the light disappears. But the light does extend outside, and therefore reaches us, and that's why we have daylight, we have sunlight, because of that. Now, the Alter Rebbe makes it clear in Shayachet V'Amunah and Perek Gimel. He says that L'mayla, you can't say that it's outside of the sun. There's no outside. Everything is within a Likus. So it's not, there's no Gashmiz Dika that Eibush is Chaz V'Sholem here, and only Eir reaches here. So basically the Moyer is concealed, but what we relate to is the Eir. And he explains this at length, and uses, of course, Tzimtzum. That's where he discusses the idea of Tzimtzum. Shemesh Mogen Hashem Elikim, that the Shemesh, so to speak, in the Nimshal is like here. However, it's completely concealed, so that way we don't get burned up. And what we can relate to is the Eir, and the Eir itself, even with Tzimtzum. So the question then is this. We all got spoiled, so to speak, because we already learned about Atzmus, and you probably know the expression, Atzmus is built in Metzias Nimtza, and my first year, I think, that I gave after this semester, this new year, was on Eir, that the difference between Eir and Moyer, the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe and Eir, is that Eir brings the built-in Metzias Nimtza of Atzmus, which is completely not relatable to us because we're a Metzias Nimtza. I'm not going to go over that because it's a whole discussion of its own. But built-in Metzias Nimtza simply means that the Eibishter, you can't say he exists like we exist, like this table exists, or like I'm standing here. We can't say he doesn't exist, Chaz v'Sholem. So we say Metzia is built in Metzias Nimtza. He exists in a non-existential way. In other words, not like as we exist. So it's basically saying he does not exist, if you want to put it in different aces. The Rebbe Rashab once said a very strong statement. Someone was speaking to Rebbe Rashab, they were talking about Kofrim and atheists. And the Rebbe Rashab expressed himself and said, in some way, an atheist is closer to the truth than Maiminim are, than believers are. And what does that mean? Because atheist says God doesn't exist. He's right. He doesn't exist the way we exist. And Maiminim say God does exist, meaning you're trying to fit God into existing like you exist. That's what the Rebbe Rashab said. There was a time when they weren't mefarsim this so much, but now it's already out there. And the Havana is very clear. He's not saying atheists are right. He's saying in a certain nekuda, they have a point. So to say God exists, you have to define what does exist mean. If you say it exists like a table in a room, no, be'efeirish not, because a table is nitfis, and this sort of table does not exist there. Metzias ha'elam, even ruchnius, everything exists only in its place. Chochmah is not bina. You can't say that on Atzmus. You can't say Atzmus is here and not there. So you have to say that his Metzias is very different than ours. So based on that principle, you can argue, you simply can argue, 1 second, how can you even say Tzimtzum and Moed altogether? In the sun, you could say a Tzimtzum, that the sun is blocked by clouds or something. You could say we don't see Atzmus because we are Mugbalim, and we can't see something that's a built Metzias Nimtza, even though he's completely here. But how could you say Tzimtzum B'chlal in Moed, whether Kipshute or not Kipshute? That would be the argument of any Chabad Chassid that has already learned what Atzmus is like. In a way, what the Alter Rebbe says in Shayach of Amunah, that Eibush is Leima Mikri Haguf, You can't suddenly apply and say he's not here, that literally he's been concealed. Amoyer, you can't l'cheda say that at all. But this is only after Chabad came to teach this. But before, there was Beferish Hashita. What does it mean in the context of what we're talking about? Remember, if Tzimtzum is coming to tell us the Eibishter Shalei Be'erech, and the only way relate to us, so now the question is the Shalei Be'erech affecting Kavyachal also, is it also the Gab of the Moyer? So there's a statement from the Alter Rebbe that you probably heard many times. It's in Teira Eir and Vayera. If you have, is there Teira Eir here? I'll read it exact Lashon. Is there Teira Eir here? I hope. Oh, good. So Alter Rebbe in Pasuk Eliyahu, I believe, Vayera, says this week's Parsha, next week's Parsha out there. So he says like this. I'll just read it inside because it will be helpful to understand. He says, "V'hini Tzimtzum hoye be'erein sof," and the Rebbe actually zeichens, I think, to this lemaimer in Teireh Dibra Masapa in the letter in Sadik Tes. Tzimtzum hazeh hoye be'erein sof, tahainu she'er nichol b'moyer. So he's teaching the Tzimtzum, the air, in other words, like let's think of it like the sunlight going back to its source. And they would have been bottled if all this was begoli. Lakach tzimtzum ha'er sheyuchel b'moyer liyisrak b'keich v'lei b'peil. There's a lot that can be said here and unpacked, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing. There's actually a whole maimer from the Rebbe Rashab called Hagos, the Pasuk Eliyahu, Tofresh Ches, that dissects every line here, and Barichas explains every word in this maimer here. Then he continues, V'yisalam boy shelo yiyeh gilui ha'er rak hamoyer. So here's the key, rak hamoyer. Here we see clearly that the Alter Rebbe is saying that Tzimtzum Zoyke Pshutei is only an air, not in moyer. Because even though Tzimtzum is necessary, because we could not tolerate and contain the air, but he says Zak b'moyer. In other words, the air is nichol b'moyer. He doesn't say that Tzimtzum is also, that the moyer is off limits. And then he adds these words. The Rebbe brings this very often in different language. He says like this, parentheses. Avol b'moyer shu ein sof atzmei. And here he means ein sof, not as an air ein sof. He means the very market of Ein Sof is also like Ein Tchila. Loi shayach tzimtzum chaz v'shalom. V'loi helam. Not tzimtzum and not helam. No, there's no siluk and not helam. In other words, complete removed or complete concealment or va'adarabah. Va'adarabah. HaMoyer hu bizgalus. The moyer is bizgalus. Now what does that mean? We don't see the moyer, so he says, Ulechein afilu tenekes yedim sheyesh sham alakam motzei. Af she'en behem hasoga v'tfisa eich uma lefi she'en behem gilui ha'er she'makol mokem ha'moyer atzmei hu nimtzu lamata k'moy lamayla. Then he goes on to explain more about the tzimtzum, which is not so negay here. So he's not just saying that you can't say tzimtzum and moyer, because it's completely off. Remember, tzimtzum is only shayach with his oyer. When you say something is concealed, that means it's implying there's something revealed that you're concealing. But if atzmos or the moyer is not called revealed because he's built in Metzias Nimtza, so you can't even call him together Gilui. Gilui itself, even though by us a Gilui is a major thing. Gilui alakus. That's the Geula. But the Eibishter, Gilui and Helam are equal. Helam is not a stiratim and Gilui is not a Maila, basically. So B'meila, since there's no element of Gilui, there's no element of Helam. But the Alter Rebbe says even further, that is actually Moiru Bizgalus. What does he mean by he says Izgalus? He means not Izgalus and Giluyim like Havon of Asoga, but the fact that a child says Baruch Hashem. The Rebbe explains it this way. Like we hear the stories with the Baal Shem Tov. Ish Poshet. You know the expression, Baal Shem Tov said that the Pshittus of Ish Poshet touches Pshittus Ha'atzmos. The child that cried out Kukuriku. The Pshittus, actually not Giluyim, is a Gilui of Atzmos Hamoiru Bizgalus. So his galus here doesn't mean Gilui as we usually understand it. His galus here means it manifests in some way. So b'meila tzimtzum didn't affect Moyer, because if it did, we wouldn't have what we call the concept of etzem haneshama. Like what's one of the basis of all arguments against when the Rebbe began advocating going out and reaching every Jew, even a tinuk shenishba, even a person who karkafta, the leimonach film, or people who are, all the tinus. Today they're less, but the tinus were, these people are completely off limits. You're putting on tefillin on a person whose goof is not noki, etc., etc., etc. And the Rebbe's main explanation throughout the years, but if you really want a full, with the Rebbe completely is Yutes Kisuf Tavshin Chav Ches. The Rebbe discussed this at length. It was right after the 6-day war. So the Rebbe was talking about the Yisrael Tshuva that was happening then in the world after the 6-day war, and that's Israel and America and other places. So the Rebbe is basically the Nekuda is, which again is by us Aleph base. We grew up with this because every Eid has an Etzem and a Neshama. It makes no difference. Afal Pishachot Yisrael, who, and the Rebbe is famous, he always brings the Gemara that talks about the din, that even a person who's Mekadosh Seisha, Menasha Nitzadik Gomer, or Menasha Nitzadik, is it a Kedushin or not? The person is a Rosh Gomer, and he's Mekadosh Menasha Tzidam, so they say, yes, Shemi Hirat Tshuva. Shemi Hirat Tshuva, his whole life he's living like a Rosh, and Al Asofik, you say that the Kedushin is Kedushin? So the answer is, because Etzem and Hashem, he always was connected. It was like the Rambam says in the Self-Pedic Bezer, Hilchas Gerushin, that it Yitzrei Hu She'onsei. When he says, and a get cannot be mu'usa, can be forced. So he says, it's not forced because Be'etzem every Eid, Mamash Chassidus Rambam there. Every Eid wants to do mitzvahs and wants to avoid Avedis. Now, but then Yitzrei She'onsei, he was forced by the Yetzirah to go away from his natural self. So when you Kefer you're just removing the obstacle, and his Etzem and Hashem is in his Gal. This is a pure implication, manifestation, Nafkamina Lepeil, that the Moyer is Bizgalos. Now again, his Galos doesn't mean he's Bigalos, because Bepeil he's a Rosh at this moment. He's not doing what he has to be doing. So it's not Gili in his Aved, like he says with the child. It's not Behavona Vasog, it's not in Gili Keichas HaNefesh Alei. But it's his Galos in his behavior, in the fact that Shema Hirar Tshuva, that Be'etzem every Eid, you can assume and expect that he may do Tshuva any second, because Be'etzem, that's what he is. Or in the Lashon of the Alter Rebbe, Eid Nishta Vil, Nishta Ken Zayin Abgerissen von Elikus. Now, if it's Tzimtzum, even if it was Kipshute, Shalei Kipshute, sorry, was in the Moyer, you couldn't say that statement. Because then you'd say the Moyer is off limits. And or at least, let me correct myself, not off limits like those that hold Kipshute. But you could say the Moyer is Shalei Berach and concealed, and it's not accessible. And here the Alter Rebbe says it's not concealed. In other words, Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshute, but only in the Oyer. So that explains those that hold that Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshute. I'm going backwards, but also in the Moyer, they would clearly, even though it doesn't spell it out here, they would clearly, so to speak, disagree with an Alter Rebbe statement, Moyer hu bizgalus. A child says Baruch Hashem and so on. So they would either explain it because it does say Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. It doesn't mean a child doesn't have any Amunah and doesn't have, like we said before, there is a Shaykhis to Lakus, La'achliyat Tzimtzum. That's also a Lakus. But to speak about the Moyer, Etzem, basically Etzem would be off limits. Even those that hold Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshute. We'll soon talk about what about those that hold Kipshute in this context. But that would be the Moyer hu bizgalus, or the Moyer is also Behelim. And Behelim, meaning it's not off limits in the sense that it's Kipshute, like we spoke about, completely inaccessible, but it's in a way, it's inaccessible from an Gili Dika perspective. In other words, the Etzem and Hashem is there, but we can't really access it in a regular fashion. Now, I said Tzimtzum Kipshute means that it's only concealed and you could ultimately access it, but that's the difference between Oyer and Moyer. If you say that Tzimtzum is only also in Moyer, then you have to say that the Moyer in some way, for at least a certain amount of time, was concealed even from everyone, even from a child and so on. If you say it's only in Eid, it's never concealed from every Yid, because the Etzem and Hashem is always Libi Eir, an Yishen of Libi Eir. And the only issue we have to deal with now is the Eir, the Tzimtzum in the Eir, not the Moyer. The Moyer is there. So every Jew in the world, every human being for that matter, you could say, has a connection to the Eibishter. And the shaila is, you have to work to reveal it, and that's the work. The work is all together of Eir. Because in the Eir, there is a Tzimtzum. And that we need, like the child, like the student has to grow and go from a state of Helam to a greater state of Gili as we grow and grow. And then at the end of the day, according to the Shita of Lekub Shute, that you come and you can access also Moyer, and that's what we say. V'niglik v'davaya Gili atzmusi yizbarach la'osed love will be dire b'tachtenim. What do we say? Dire b'tachtenim. Dire le'atzmusei. That's the Moyer. But it'll also be begili b'tachtenim. In other words, also in real Giluyim, not just in the Gili Hamoyer who would be Zgalos like in a child. And that would be the Shitta of Chabad, obviously, and the Shitta, that's the Shitta that the Tzimtzum also in Moyer, what the Rebbe says is the Shitta of the Shemer Amunim, and the Nefesh HaChaim, would be that the Moyer also is somewhat off limits, or at least concealed. Whether they hold that has to remain that way, not necessarily. It could be in time. There'll be the Gilead Atzmus. Or you could say, no, the Moyer is Bechlal, something that's that the Eibishter cannot make accessible to us because a Moyer is Atzmus, and Atzmus is never really directly accessible. So it's not B'derech Shlila necessarily like the Shit of Kipshute, but at least it's in the category of something that is affected by the Tzimtzum, and essentially would say we can access Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum through Aveda, but not Moyer. That would be, the truth is this can be debated and argued because we don't really have a nowhere that says this, but Fedish exactly all the details of this Shita. I'm just trying to unpack it a bit and try to discuss it in this context. So this is one of the ways to understand it. As I said, it's a question what they would hold after Aveda would, because it's not Kipshute, the Tzimtzum, even according to the Shita that it's in the Moyer, would they hold that would change in time if indeed we were able to access Eretz Sef Lifnei Tzimtzum through Aveda, then why not access it also to the Moyer? But that's, as I said, you can argue both ways, like I just said. Either the Moyer remains removed in a sense, not that the Eibush is not here, Chaz v'Sholom, but I mean from us, or the Moyer also will ultimately also be relatable through our Aveda and so on, like I just explained. So, okay. So now let's go to the next. Anybody wants to ask anything? Because I'm going to go to the other two shittas now. So now let's move to the first two shittas, which is the difference: is the Tzimtzum K'Pshutei Begam B'Atzmusei, or only Rak Ba'oir? So, which would be the Yesh Lavav and the Gra, as I said, either one of the two, according to the Rebbe's way of interpreting the Gra. So here, let's go now back to that approach. Remember, the Kipshute means that Sof Kol Sof is coming to emphasize the Einarecha Velakus, not the Kiruv. So let me just elaborate on that. It'll help understand the context. We know that all of Chassidus talks about Ava v'Yira, talks about two kavim. You know, the kav of Kiruv, Ava, that we have V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, but there's also Yiras Shamayim, L'mantiras Hashem. What's the difference between the two? So in simple words, Ava means a state of Kiruv. You feel the Eibush is close to you, you're close to him, like you have Ava ben Ish v'Isha, or Ava between friends. So there's Ava closeness. The Eibush provides for you. We say V'achalta v'Savota, Hazanas HaKeil, every morning, Birchas HaShachar, basically, and all Birchas HaNenin is thanking the Eibush for providing for me, for sustaining me, Mal B'Sharumim, Zeikav Kfufim, and all that. Meidani Lefanecha. This is a hergish, a tnua of Kiruv. But why we need Yira then? Because we know the Eibush is Shalei Be'erechtas, he's beyond us. Yira emphasizes the tnua of Richuk. Not Richuk as in distance in a negative way, but the Eibush is not your chaver, he's not chaver lap to you. So we say Taka Avinu, but we also say Malkeinu. And you say Em Kabonim, Em Kavodim. We have the Ben relationship, which is more Kiruv. Eved is more like a Melech. Yiras HaMelech. And then you need both of them. If you only have Richuk, meaning only the Shalei Berech, then there's no relationship really, Be'efim Pnimi. If you only have Ava, you're missing the so-called Shalei Berech. So in a way, Mamala Kalam and Sevav Kalam. And Mamala, and we need both all the time. Mamala Kalam is the Eibishter's, the Lakus is Mitzamtzim itself, and tailored Lefi Erech Eres Bekelim. That's Kiruv. But there's always something hovering, what we call Makif, and the Alter Rebbe means, Makif doesn't mean surrounding, it means that we can't, it's not Begili. It always remains above our head, so to speak. And you'll see this through all of Yiddishkeit. The Sukkah is Makif, the Dal Minim is Pnimi, a Talis is Makif, Tzitzis is Pnimi. And throughout everywhere in Yiddishkeit, you'll find Makif Pnimi, and it's always this balance. And as we also know, it's relative. As today's, you learn Torah today, some things you'll understand, some things will remain above your head. Tomorrow, that which was above your head today will become understandable. Then you'll have another higher level that you need to understand. So it's always a process of internalizing Elikus, but also something remains beyond us. So the shittas of Kipshute, Shlei Kipshute is really a question of the emphasis. Well, it's more than emphasis, to be honest. But according to the shitta of Kipshute, as I mentioned, is talking about emphasizing the Shalei Be'erech. So Eirei Sof Acharat Tzimtzum, the Kav, and everything after the Tzimtzum, that is meant to be Bepnimius. But Lifnei Tzimtzum remains Kipshute because it's off limits in any Chiyuv Dika way, as I explained. So the question now is, to what extent is that? And that would be the two shittas here. If you say it's only in the Oyer, so you could argue, and this is several ways you can explain this. If you say Tzimtzum Kipshute, Barak Ba'oyer, what does that mean? That according to the Shitta, the Moyer is either completely off limits, but I would say the other way around. Before I say that, I don't want to confuse matters. So let me just retract that a moment. That means that the Moyer, you don't have it. The Moyer is, the Tzimtzum Kipshute is not in the Moyer. So then what is the relationship with the Moyer? So the answer could be one, either it's completely beyond, not the same way it's Tzimtzum Shlei Kipshute, which we'll talk about shortly. It's completely beyond, in other words, we don't even talk about it. Because like, Ein Lano Esek B'Nestoris, it's Ma B'Lefonim, Ma La'ocher. And the only thing we're talking about is the Ein HaReich that we experience beside Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. So in other words, it's Kipshute. So we don't have a direct relationship with it, only through Shlila, because it's Shalei Be'erech to us, but it's only with Oyer you're dealing with. So in other words, you can have a Yediyas HaShlila, so to speak, or a component, the Shlila Ha'elam, but it's L'gabe Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, but the Moed is completely beyond everything. Technically, you could say, that the opposite also. You could say that whole Tzimtzum Kipshute, but also in the Moed, I'm sorry, only in the Oyer, is because they hold the Moed is maybe B'his Galus. But I don't think you can touch that way because even those that hold Shalei Kipshute and it's in Moed is not B'his Galus, like I said, so it's hard to say that the shit of the Yeshua Levov is that the Moed is, because the Rebbe makes it clear that his reason is because the Melech can't be B'mokem HaAshpa, and the Melech here is not the Eir. We're talking about the Moed. We're talking about the very Moed of the Atzmusei, he says. So you have to say basically that Atzmusei is completely beyond the whole thing, and even you can't even say Shalei Be'erech on Atzmus.
Why you said according to this parallel to Rebbe, you wouldn't say the Yeshua Levov says as much as Gal?
Because even those that hold that Tzimtzum is not Kipshute, but also Moyer, they already disagree with the Moyer B'his Galus, because that's why they say it's also in the Moyer. Those that hold Kipshute and Moyer is even more beyond. That's the simple logic, Because I was thinking about it. I was thinking this stam, I'm not even sure if it has any basis. I was saying, can you say a shita that the Tzimtzum is Kipshute only in the Moyer, but not in the Oyer? The opposite of what the Rebbe is saying here. But it doesn't make sense to me. I was thinking, can you say such a thing? In other words, a Moyer is completely off limits, but the Oyer is not in Ganzen off limits. You'd say Kipshute legabe the Moyer, but not Kipshute legabe the Oyer. But the Rebbe doesn't say that, and doesn't even bring such a fifth shita. So I will obviously not go there. But in Inyan, just for discussion purposes, it may be something interesting to compare. Here's the opposite. The Kipshute is either Batzmusei and in the Oyer, or only in the Oyer. Nowhere does it say only in Atzmusei and not in the Oyer. So you have to say them, the pshat and the whole thing is that the Kipshute makes it that if we can't access Alikus be'efin chiyuvi, like I said, it's like somewhat through Slilas ha'elam, you can relate to it, but not through Bislapshus and Primius. That's why it's Kipshute. The shaila is this only Legabe Eir or also Legabe Moyer? So if it's only Legabe Eir, so Moyer is completely off limits. Whereas the Shita, the first Shita, that the Tzimtzum Kipshute and also Moyer, it says something like this. And this again is B'derech Efshar. I'm not sure if this is correct. I'm more than happy to hear other theories and other explanations. Then you'd have to say that when you say Shalei Be'erech, you're also talking about Atzmus. Because that's why he's talking about Tzimtzum Kipshute also in Moyer, that also the Moyer is somewhat involved, but only b'derech shlila. So the truth is that the second shita seems, which he said, the second shita was who did he say this? Or possibly the gra, because in a way the second shita is actually makes atzmus even greater, because he saw beyond that you can't say tzimtzum kipshute altogether. Whereas in the first shita, in a sense, you're making the moyer also subject to tzimtzum kipshute, which the Alter Rebbe is clearly shalel in Shayach Damuna betachlis ha-shlila, because for all the reasons. But the Yeshel Levov, who of course are Gadol Shabigdalim, can move him just to defend his position, so to speak, as the Rebbe did, was not coming to make Chaz v'Shalom that the moyer is subject to tzimtzum or kipshute. It was on the Adrabah. He wanted to make that the Eibishter social be'erech to existence. That's why it's kipshute. That was basically his emphasis. But he's also focusing on the moyer, meaning that the etzem itself. Now, in Inyan, you can bring about this and say, you know what, if we had all these people sitting here now, the Baal Meshach Sidim, Emmanuel Chayreki, and you had maybe the Gra too, and the Nefesh HaChaim, and the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe, you know, what would the conversation look like? You could in Inyan say that after everybody hears all the different shittas and the explanations, that there wouldn't be necessarily a fundamental disagreement. There'd be a disagreement maybe halacha lepeil, but every hashkafa has merit to it. It's like you say, even the halacha is like Beis Hillel, doesn't mean that the Beis Shammai doesn't have merit. And the Rebbe made it very clear, which was a big chiddush by Chassidim in Tafshin Lamed Aleph, as I mentioned, and the subsequent years, that he was giving merit to the other shittas. Usually, Tzimtzum Kipshute was so dismissed, it was almost like considered Avodah Zarah. But when the Rebbe is medayik in Tanya, you see the Alter Rebbe doesn't say that at all. And the Rebbe makes it very clear that they're coming to bring out a certain point. And we all know in Torah, even if something's not the halacha like that, it illuminates an element of shalei berach. So really, you could say, if the Baal Mishna Chassidim, who holds Tzimtzum Kipshute and also in the Moyer, if he heard what Atzmus, how Atzmus is explained by the Alter Rebbe and by Chassidim, by the Rabbeim of Basenu Nesienu of Chabad, would he also hold the same thing? It could be the way he understood Atzmus. You either have to say Atzmus is off limits, or you have access to him. So he came to the conclusion that the Tzimtzum of the Arizal is saying that Tzimtzum is literal. We know there's an Atzmus, but the Atzmus is always going to be Shalei Be'erech. But if he came to understand that Atzmus is built to Metzias Nimtza, and I'm not saying he didn't understand that. The question is whether he thought that would fit into our discussion, because there's no question through the generations the levels of alakus are constantly being elevated. What I mean by that is, you look in the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, except for a few very explicit places, he doesn't talk about Atzmus in every Maimer. You know, talks about it in the Geras HaKedah Simon Chof. He talks about it somewhat in this concept, in this context of Tzimtzum Kipshute. But you're not going to find it. Most of my Marim you're not going to find. I mean, it says Atzmus, but it doesn't speak of it. Pasach Eliyahu, you can say he's talking about Atzmus here, the Moyer Bizgalus. You look, for example, by contrast, the Rebbe Rashab, he has gone some pages about Atzmus. And the Rebbe took it even further. I mean, you think about it, it's not because they were being mechadish necessarily only. Obviously, as we get closer to Mashiach, you talk about higher and higher levels of Elikus. If you think about how many places Maimonim before the Rebbe Rashab, well, I would say before the Tzemach Tzedek, but you know what, I have to correct that because the Mittler Rebbe also speaks about it. But how many Maimonim the Alter Rebbe speak about Dargis Lifnei HaTzimtzum? I would challenge you to find too many Maimonim, very few. He hints to it and says certain things, but it's developed primarily by the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe Rash and Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Rashab takes it completely to another level where you could see, if you look in the Erech Sefer Erechim, Erech Ein Sof, and the Dargis, you'll see, look at the Mar Mekemis, most of it, explanation of levels before the Tzimtzum is the Rebbe Rashab. Now what, the Alter Rebbe, why didn't the Alter Rebbe want to speak about those levels? There's reasons why. Because everything goes just like the Teres Achsidus Bechlal was in this Gala B'Deres Achreinim, and the same thing in Nigla. Everything always goes min haklal el aprat, like Mishnah, and then comes Gemara. Why don't they just megala the Gemara right away? It doesn't work that way. So basically, Torah, that's how Torah is nishtalshel. In this case, it's not just more protein, but it's also higher and higher levels, which clearly, as we get closer to Geula, the whole point is Gili Atzmus B'Tachtenim. So though that statement Dira b'tachtenim is from Tanya Perek Lamed Vav, but the emphasis on Atzmusei, in Tachtenim, and all that comes with that is far later Maimorim, later generations. I'm only saying that because then you could maybe explain somewhat the Shtalshlus even of the Shittas of Tzimtzum Kipshute and Oyer and Moyer, and understand in a way that we can relate to it all. So I think I covered, I mean, a lot of Riches go much more by Riches, covered more or less the basics of it, and also the Nafkamina B'Peil, which comes down to two main points. One is, can we engage Elikus on all levels in this world, Neif and Chiyuvi, or is it only Shlila? And as I mentioned last week, again, this doesn't mean that according to Chassidus Chabad, everything is Chiyuv. Kemufah, there's Sur Marah, and there are boundaries and laws. You can't do anything you want. There's Atayr and Halacha. But ultimately, you can. The world is capable of becoming a Keli Elikus. Whereas Tzimtzum Kipshuti would not say it's a Keli, would say it's more B'derech Shlila. And the second point is, what level do we actually relate to? Is it Eir and Moir, or only one of those levels? And of course, it's very different when you talk Kipshute and Shanelai Kipshute, as I explained before. So that is essentially, that sums that up. If anybody has any questions, we have a few more minutes. I'd be happy to take questions. And of course, this is all recorded, so you can always review it again if you like. Okay, so fine, we'll stop here. Go ahead, yeah. But also in the Moed, yeah, that's what the Rebbe says. Beferish, in the letter, he says it clearly.
Then he should have a shitta more like Chabad in regards to Avamir.
The problem is, once you apply Tzimtzum Kipshute to Moed, you're essentially saying that in some way it limits the accessing the Etzem HaNeshama by every Id. So, regarding Ava V'yira, yeah, why not? You could say that he has both sides, that first of all, remember, everybody holds his Ava V'yira. Even those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute, they don't say it's only Yira. Ava is a mitzvah daraisa. The question is whether the Welt can be a Keli Telekus. That Eid v'haftas Hashem Elekecha b'chol vavcha b'chol nafsha b'chol meidecha. Even the Yeshua Levav is Chaz v'Shalom going to say there's no Ava. The only question is, how does it affect the entire existence? According to the Nefesh HaChaim, which he comes closer to the Alter Rebbe in the sense that he says it's not Kipshute. That's a big chiddush. As soon as you say it's not Kipshute, you're already saying that it's accessible, but the question is how accessible. So I would say, if the Nefesh HaChaim, would he agree with the sending shluchim all over the world? I don't know. Based on the shit of this, you could say that it's not that accessible, but I have to think about it. I'm not sure exactly how that would translate, but it's definitely, because it's in the Moyer, it has to affect the Moyer Bizgalus, which is a Yisod Ikri, that we believe that every Jew has a connection to the Etzem, even when they're not acting on it. And so it would explain that why you can even explain why the Litvisha world, even though they may not have a shit about it, they just are doing it based on what they makabel, that they have a problem dealing with so-called very secular people, or even when you deal with them, there's still an us and them, that we're superior, meaning the Shem D'Tei and Mitzvahs are superior. But that concept that everyone has an Etzem and a Neshama, and we're equals, Kulam Asimes, but Avechel Kolona, that could be that where the Nefesh HaChaim, because the Moyer was affected by the Tzimtzum, meaning the Moyer Shebetech every Nefesh also would maybe not appreciate it fully in that same sense. That's how I would probably distinguish.
The Alter Rebbe is share with the Catholics, the Shita Sakeh from the
That's Perek Beis, yeah, that's for sure.
So could you just address that? And yet at the same time, we're saying that Tzimtzum Kipshute makes more sense. Which makes more sense?
Okay, one second. Perek Beis, I just refer to you. This was, I'll give you a little history. This is interesting. In Shabbos Pasha Matis Maseh, Tov Shin Mem, the Rebbe basically seemingly conflated the two. And he said that Be'etzem could be Yisavas B'chol Rega. I'm sorry. Be'etzem Yisavas could be not B'chol Rega. Why is the Alter Rebbe right B'chol Rega? Because he was makabel like that from his Rebbeim. But Be'etzem it could not be, and Adarabah. The Eibishter could have planted, these are the Rebbe's words. a koyach adir, b'tchilas habriya, that would give enough energy for all shit alpha shnin, like shalheves elamei. And those that hold that is coming from gadlus habeira, not mitzad. You got that? So we asked the Rebbe. I was the main maniach.
Which year?
Tov Shemem, Mathis Masei Tov Shemem. So I wrote to the Rebbe, in Pedig Beis, it says those that hold Esavis is not Bechor Rega, because they're what does it say? They compare it to Tachbulis Ish, that's Yesh Miyesh. That's not Mitzad Gadlus Abeda, that's Mitzad Aveda Zora, that's Mitzad Ozav Hashem, Mitzad Chesron Abeda. Alter Rebbe's Shelet B'Tachlis. So that's what the Rebbe, in the next Parsha, next Shabbos, Devarim, Tov Shin Mem, Fabringen went until 8:05. Shabbos, it was a long Shabbos summer. Went from 1:30 to 8:05, one of the longest Fabringens. And the last hour of the Fabringen, the Rebbe spoke about this, mamish, an hour. So we're talking about 7 o'clock at night. The Rebbe lost in this in a beautiful way, by Spashtus Azeh. And he basically, I'm not going to go through the whole Sikh, you can look it up. They adapted it in one of it's there, the Hanocha is complete. They adapted it in Lakut Sichas Chelik Chafei Teskislev in Ha'aris, you'll see, based on the Sichas of this Nevarim Tov Shemem. And the Rebbe there said, that was when he said that we're confusing two things. Pedig Beis is talking Mitzach Sorin HaBeira, where they're comparing the Eibishter to a person who takes a Keli, Yesh Miyesh. Pedig Zayin, the Rebbe says, even though they're not mentioning Tzimtzum, he mentioned only Hisavos, he says Mitzad Gadlus HaBeira. Because other Rebbe, and that's why he said it makes more logical. He didn't say it then Fabringen. He said it Shmini Atzeres Lamed Aleph by the Suda. That's why it makes more sense, because if you're talking about Gadlus Habeira, and the Eibishter could do whatever he wants, and remember, Lifnei Tzimtzum, there are no rules of logic. So then it makes more sense to make that the Eibishter does not need to be Mahav every second, and therefore also doesn't need a Tzimtzum. What does he need a Tzimtzum for? I mean, let me correct myself. That the Tzimtzum could be Pshute. But over then, the Alter Rebbe was Makabel otherwise, and therefore he was Malbish and Seichel. And now, of course, when we explain it, it's a very Geshmak explanation as well. That's how the Rebbe deals with those two things. But I would refer you to that Sikhet if you really want to understand this whole Nekudah. Okay. Don't worry, there were questions after Dvarim Tov Shemem, Rabbi Olav Hashalom, and the Rebbe then, Parsha Re'eh, gave a chelik to the whole, I'll just conclude with what the Rebbe said. In Tov Shemem, the Rebbe said at the end of the Sikha, he says, Halavai, mizozach kochen in di inyanim from Tzimtzum, and the Savis Yesh Ma'ayin, and statt kochen sich in the Unterschied zwischen Nehura Tichla, Chivra, the Uchma, the people are arguing whether it's blue, but it's a Bloya Licht, it's a Bloya, or the Segel, or the Sevais. I mean, the Rebbe wasn't obviously being shell, he was just saying the koch sich in technicalities, mizozach kochen in the Grace Sugis. That's what the Rebbe said. And there was no Fabring in Veschanan and Ekev that year. We asked more questions. And especially Rabbi wrote a whole thing to the Rebbe Barichus, where he could not really understand this whole thing, as I mentioned, because it was mamish Iber Kernish in the whole way we understood Tanya, etc. And then Shabbos Pasharei, the Rebbe was not happy. He says, if I stays, I'm a Kleibzach nicht voneinander, it's better as sich kochen in the Sache, was man versteht, and dafür is gehen in die Janim, was man versteht noch nicht. In other words, it was a big, the Rebbe gave a big bitush by saying, okay, I'm trying to basically, I'm saying my words, I'm trying to reveal new dargas, and you just want me to go back to the old understanding of it. So, better kochzich and things you're comfortable with. And he was mevatel. I remember the Rebbe said then, soll emitzim in Masber sein, der Unterschied zwischen der Keach HaGvul und Gvul. Man sagt, the Eibishter has a Keach HaGvul, but you don't say Gvul Chaz v'shalom. The Rebbe said, what's the difference? It's dak min hadak, where you say keich gvul or gvul. I remember, he should have a lichtik again in Rabbi. I remember he told me, he says, that completely threw him. He says, what do you mean? Keich gvul, gvul is a major difference. But he couldn't understand it. And so I told him, Rabbi, if she does Achav, was versteht English. It's not like you have to, that guf is part of the Aveda. But later years, in Memvov and so on, he was already makablet because the Rebbe was so adamant and repeated so many times. It was very clear that it's not open for shakavatari. This is the way it is, and that's it. So good. Everyone have a good day. And here. Kol tov, be well.